Hey trumpet nerds, welcome back to John Talks Trumpet. This week, something a little bit more reflective. We'll be unpacking my most significant mouthpiece relationships, what drew me in, what lessons I learned, and why we broke up. Just a quick disclaimer, none of the mouthpieces I talk about breaking up with in this video are bad mouthpieces at all. Many of them are beautifully constructed and work super well for people who have formed long-term relationships with them. They were just not the perfect match for me. So like most people, when I first started playing the trumpet, I was playing on a Bach 7C. I played on a few Bach mouthpieces before settling on my first long-term mouthpiece relationship, a Monette B4S and the accompanying C4S. My teacher actually played a Monette, and so did the principal player in the youth orchestra that I was playing in. There was one time we were in a rehearsal, and he lent me his extra Monette mouthpiece, and we played together next to each other with Monette mouthpieces, and that was my first time feeling like I really fit in with the section. You know, it was just so powerful to feel like the overtones lock in together, even though I didn't know what that was at the time. The other thing about Monette mouthpieces is that at the time especially, but even now, they have these amazing YouTube videos where they have famous players playing their equipment. That, and also all of their mouthpiece literature on their website, had me convinced that they were the best mouthpiece makers in existence, and that if I was playing one of them, all the problems would be because of me and not because of the mouthpiece I was playing. Like many high school players, I had endurance issues while playing solos and brass quintet literature, and also tended to get pretty sharp playing in the upper register. I mean, again, this is pretty typical for a high schooler, but probably exacerbated by the unique nature of these mouthpieces. Looking back, probably the throat and the backbore were way too big for me at that age, and so in other words, she was a little mature for me. When I got to Arizona State, where I studied with Dave Hickman, he noticed that my articulation wasn't quite as clear as he wanted it to be, and so he suggested switching to more conventional equipment. At first, we experimented with some Bach mouthpieces that were in his collection, but within a few months, we had settled on his specialty mouthpiece, the Giddings & Webster David Hickman Big Boy mouthpiece. There were several things that drew me to this mouthpiece. Of course, my teacher plays it, so that's the strongest endorsement that I could have at the time. It has a very, very cushioned rim, which I thought would help me solve my endurance problems. It has a 1B cup, a 22 throat, and a very large version of a 24 backbore. The most notable thing about this mouthpiece is that it's made in stainless steel, which is different than a typical silver-plated brass mouthpiece. So this relationship lasted 7 or 8 months. At first, I was really happy with how comfortable the rim was, and I felt like I could never hurt myself playing it. And again, because my teacher played it, I assumed that all the problems were going to be operator error, and not because of the mouthpiece itself. Knowing what I know now, looking back, this mouthpiece is still really quite big. Most of the professionals that I know don't play mouthpieces as big as this one. I had some pretty rocky moments with this mouthpiece, if I'm being honest. Anytime I was playing a solo recital or a brass quintet piece, I felt myself just sort of falling apart in the middle because this mouthpiece, as well designed as it was just simply too big for me at this stage of development. So how did this relationship end? Well, I sort of cheated on her. I showed up in an opera pit for a rehearsal at school, and I brought along another new mouthpiece with some unique features that I was experimenting with. So this next mouthpiece is the one that I cheated on the previous one with. This other mouthpiece was a much more conventional mouthpiece in most ways, made from regular brass plated with silver, and had a much more standard mouthpiece weight. It is actually a wedge-style mouthpiece made by Austin Custom Brass, an ACB Wedge 1. Again, I've always been a sucker for unique designs and sort of exotic looks. What's unique about these wedge mouthpieces is that they have a very exotic rim design. It's not flat on the top, but rather sort of bowed down. It works a little bit differently than you might assume. The parts that stick out are actually on the top and bottom, and they have little indicators where the top and bottom are, a little dash on the rim there. The marketing for this kind of mouthpiece was really strong. Again, I was convinced that this kind of mouthpiece would solve the problems that I was facing on the trumpet. So this mouthpiece and I were together for about 4 months. It was a pretty rocky time, to be honest. Some red flags I eventually did notice with this mouthpiece was that the middle and low registers worked really well, but above middle C or so, I start to use some pressure to equalize the pucker in my embouchure, and pressure doesn't really work the same way when the mouthpiece isn't flat. So for me, I found that my upper register got sharper and sort of out of whack because I was trying to compensate with other aspects of my anatomy to make up for the inability to use pressure. If you read the Wedge marketing materials, Dave Harrison, the creator, actually talks about responders and non-responders. I was convinced that I could become a responder to this mouthpiece by playing it for long enough, but in reality, I was a non-responder from the start. I thought I needed to grow into this mouthpiece and let it teach me something, but in the end, it just sounded bad, and it was a bad fit for me. This next relationship brings me happy memories. This was my first ever really stable relationship with a mouthpiece. It was a Bach 1 1/4 C with a 24 throat and a 24 B backbore. Alterations done by Charlie Butler, former principal trumpet of the Seattle Symphony. This was sort of like my first emotionally mature relationship with a mouthpiece. We were together for about a year, actually. For the first time, I could actually see a future with this mouthpiece. The problems with this mouthpiece were really subtle. It had a really nice middle and low register, a totally usable high register with good intonation, but I still had problems playing for longer periods, even than some of my peers using similar equipment. It turns out that this was probably due to the rim shape itself being sort of rounded, and it got moved around my face a little bit easier than I wanted it to. I wanted a little bit more grip. But at the end of the day, the reason that I left this mouthpiece was because we sort of grew apart. There was a big change near the end of my time with this mouthpiece. I actually had my tonsils removed. They were so big that they were, sort of like balls almost touching each other like this. And so when they were removed, it sort of changed my anatomy in a way that was significant enough to mean that it was time to change a mouthpiece. Alongside getting my tonsils removed, I had actually just gotten a new C trumpet, my Yamaha Chicago 2 that you've seen in my other videos. This trumpet was different enough from my previous equipment that it basically warranted a change in mouthpiece even on its own. The lesson here being that things can work really well for a while, but eventually changes happen and you grow apart. Okay, so following my tonsil surgery and my new C trumpet, I knew that this was a good time to try a new kind of mouthpiece. What attracted me to this mouthpiece, the Yamaha John Hagstrom mouthpiece, was that John Hagstrom was the primary influence on the Yamaha Chicago series trumpets. And so, in my mind, if he was using a mouthpiece like this on this trumpet, then it probably was a good balance. It has a uniquely small rim, a 5 to 7 Bach size rim that was a custom rim made for Vince DiMartino that's sort of flat and cushioned. It had a 1B cup, a 26 throat, and a little bit smaller than usual 24 backbore. My relationship with this mouthpiece was really strong. We were together for about a year and a half, actually. I played it all the way through my senior year, including my senior recitals and also all of my graduate school auditions. There were some red flags early on that I didn't really pay attention to. A little bit loss of low range, actually, because of the smaller rim diameter. But I was willing to overlook that because it was an extremely efficient mouthpiece that made it easier for me to get through my graduate school auditions and recitals, and still gave me the orchestral sound that I was looking for. This was a period of really strong development, not only because of the equipment I was using, but also I was getting more familiar with Chicago school, Arnold Jacobs teaching, and was really taking seriously my development as an orchestral trumpet player. Eventually, in graduate school, me and a bunch of friends were sort of collaborating in a practice room together, and we were, sort of testing each other's limits. And what they discovered was they were like, "Oh, you can't play loud." And I was like, "Really? I always thought I could play loud." And they were like, "No, but loud. No, play louder, louder." And I kept trying to go for it, but I just couldn't, And I think part of the reason for that was because of the smaller throat size. A smaller throat, a 26 in this case, just allows less air through the mouthpiece. And so it wasn't a perfect fit for me to fit with my new colleagues. This relationship ended when I got in touch with Diane Parke and asked her about the Parke Hagstrom series mouthpieces, which are slightly different but inspired by the very same design. Primary feature about the Parke Hagstroms that drew me in was that you can scale up and down each of the sizes, not only the rim but also the cup depth, the throat, and the backbore. So she sent me a mouthpiece that I used for a while after that was also a Hagstrom design. I played that Parke Hagstrom for almost a year, but when I went to Tanglewood, I took some lessons with the BSO trumpet section, and they noticed that some of the problems I was having might be related to the unique design of the mouthpiece, and they encouraged me to just try something more conventional again. So that brought me to my next mouthpiece, a Bach 1.5C 25 throat stock back bore. I played this mouthpiece for 8 or 9 months. You know, I went on tour, played recitals, lots of orchestra concerts, but I never really felt totally comfortable on the rim. Since it gave me a conventional orchestral sound that I really liked, I thought I was going in the right direction. The red flags were that the rim really never felt quite right to me, even though the diameter was probably really close. The high register also sort of felt restrictive and a little bit flat, actually. How did this relationship end? I actually had a fling with her older sister, a 25 throat 24 back bore 1.5C that I got from Osman. What was crazy about this fling is that I only played that mouthpiece for 3 weeks, but I took it to 4 orchestral auditions, made finals in 3, and won my first job on it. Even though this ended up not being a mouthpiece I used for very long, I thought it was really important that I keep it because I won my first job on it. I actually had CLT stamped into it. So the reason this relationship ended was that, funnily enough, I had ordered another Parke mouthpiece about 6 months before winning my job, and it showed up in the mail about a week after I got back from the auditions. When I played that mouthpiece, I immediately knew it was a better fit than the Bach, even though I had seen so much success on it. Sometimes in relationships, you don't really know what's wrong until you find something that works better. So finally, we're on my current relationship, a Parke 640 280 24 Orchestral. If you want to know what those numbers mean, go ahead and check out my Parke mouthpiece sizing video. What drew me into this mouthpiece? Of course, not only the legendary Parke mouthpiece reputation, but also my previous experiences working with Diane and knowing that I could size up and down each aspect of the mouthpiece. I knew already that I liked the sound concept of these mouthpieces and I liked how I sounded on them, but this was a more dialed in version for me. So I've actually been playing this mouthpiece for about 3 years, and like my actual human wife, I sort of just knew right away. We hit it off. The mark of any good relationship is understanding its limitations as well as its strengths. Things that I love about this mouthpiece are, I've really gotten used to not only the exact rim diameter, but also the rim shape that they use for the orchestral series, which is like a Bach 1X style rim. It's sort of flat and it has sort of a sharp bite. For me, I feel like one thing I still wish was sometimes I wish I had a little bit more of a brilliant sound, but then if I go for a slightly shallower cup, then I end up losing a little bit of the lows that I need for my job as a second trumpet player. One thing about playing second trumpet is that you often have to not only play low, but also play high in a similar style and sound concept to the principal player. So any good mouthpiece for a second trumpet player is going to be a bit of a compromise. The reason this relationship has lasted so long is because the negatives don't outweigh the positives. I've spent a long time figuring out what works for me, and I feel like this is as close as I've ever gotten. It just feels good to play, and I feel like it brings out the best parts of my sound concept. Sometimes I experiment with very similar mouthpieces, either slightly deeper, slightly narrower, slightly shallower, but every time I come back to this one because it just happens to be the right balance. My main takeaway here is that there's no perfect person and there's no perfect mouthpiece. All of us who have been in a bad relationship know what it's like to not be able to see the red flags. I feel really grateful for the people in my life who spoke up and told me when something was not quite right for me, as well as all the mouthpieces that I've tried that didn't work out for me that taught me things that I now get to share with you all. Life is so much better when you find something that fits. Thank you so much for joining me for today's unique episode of John Talks Trumpet. Feel free to share some of your craziest or worst or most interesting mouthpiece relationship or breakup stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel if you want to see more videos as soon as they come out. New videos every Tuesday.